25. So you are a district that is getting less vulnerable as compared to your other districts in the state. Your vulnerability has gone from 83 percentile to 84 percentile to 90th percentile. Okay, so as it stands right now, there are only two schools out of 100, districts out of 100 that are less vulnerable than Mountain View is. Achievement, well, you're at the 24th percentile to the 7th percentile to the 5th percentile. Okay, so with this most recent year, it would be 95, 95 schools out of 100 are outperforming Mountain View Wisman. Looking at these four metrics. Now, what's interesting is that because this is a true relative advantage, it takes into consideration the movement of schools and districts outside of Mountain View Wisman. You're compared to the growth or the regression of other entities in the state. So your data can stay exactly the same with no growth up, no reduction down, and your placement in terms of relative advantage can change because of the movement of other places. So for instance, you have very slight movement in almost identical data in the achievement category. Okay, almost identical from year on to year, maybe 1 or 2% here and there. But your percentile ranking for achievement has continued to go down and down and down. What that says is that it's not really necessarily an effect of your data because your data is staying the same. It's meaning that other entities within the state, other districts within the state are showing more growth than Mountain View Wisman is for some of those groups. Thus, they're taking steps forward while you're staying the same. So relatively, it looks like steps backward. So if that makes sense, right? That's kind of the relative nature of the way that we collectively look at it. We come up with a relative advantage number just to kind of help quantify that relationship. And so basically what you do is you take that vulnerability percentile and you subtract it from your state-based ranking percentile, and it gives you on a kind of a singular operating number to say how close to zero and or positive can we get? Because zero would mean that students are in the system are performing at where vulnerability would predict. A positive number in relative advantage would be an indicator that a school is outperforming where vulnerability would predict students to achieve. And a negative number would mean a district and or schools are underperforming where vulnerability would predict students to achieve. I appreciate your patience. That's a lot. That's a lot of information. So when we look at it by site, okay, so we have the same data, just in a different graphic. We have, but by site. So we have vulnerability level across the bottom. So we have most vulnerable category, moderately vulnerable, and less vulnerable. And on the left-hand side, you have achievement level, low achievement, moderate achievement, and high achievement. If a school, in this case a school, has the vulnerability level matching their achievement level, they're going to fall in that black rectangle, which means that students are performing exactly where vulnerability would predict them to be. Not where their potential is, not where their ceiling is, but where vulnerability would predict them to score. Now, if a school winds up above their black rectangle, that means that they are outperforming where vulnerability would predict. And if they wind up below the black rectangle, it means they're underperforming where vulnerability would predict. So in this case, Castro, as this first example, is a most vulnerable school that is achieving currently in the low category. So that is where community-based vulnerability would predict them to score, and so they wind up in the black rectangle box. Over the course of time, with extra, treatment, you would want them eventually to score above that line into the moderate, into the high, because you're not really going to change vulnerability overnight. You can change achievement relatively short order. So we don't have any schools that were in the moderate level of vulnerability, but as you go over to the less vulnerable schools, you have in the black rectangle upper right hand corner where you have less vulnerable schools that are achieving at the high achievement category. You have Amai, Stevenson, and Buck, okay, which means that they are performing where the vulnerability would predict students to perform. Then you have Montaloma and Landals that are less vulnerable schools, but performing in the moderate category. so kind of one stage below where vulnerability would predict. And then in the still less vulnerable category, but performing in the low achievement category, the Crittenden, Mistral, Graham, Vargas, and Therakoff, who are 2 levels below where community-based vulnerability would predict achievement to be. Okay. And again, 2 asterisks mean it was a deep dive school, and 1 asterisk means it was a light touch school. Light touch just means 3-hour visit. Deep dive means 3-day, 2 to 3 day visit. The next chunk, we'll start to look at student success profiles. We'll try to do that in 3 levels. We do realize that in a pre-K, you don't have graduation and necessarily college and career readiness metrics, but we do have predictors. So we'll look at some predictors of those things and how they interact in an elementary district. So each section will kind of come with a preview. So the first level of preview in terms of testing and grades is that in general, student outcomes don't reach the levels that community-based vulnerability would predict. That was just what we went over in the vulnerability index, right? The vulnerability would predict students are achieving higher than where a majority of schools have landed. Overall data trends since pre-pandemic have been flat in ELA and math, with recent declines in more vulnerable student groups. And then students learning English, students that are IEP, those identifying as Hispanic, Latino, and socioeconomically disadvantaged are lagging behind their classmates in both language arts and math. So we have this, just really quickly, when we talk about, equity, we talk about wanting to have acceleration of student achievement, we kind of use this as an organization as a graphic, right? There have been gaps in academic data since they started collecting it in the late 40s and early 50s in the traditional model. And these days, those gaps still exist. And it is relatively common to be able to look at a stack of achievement data and be able to identify which groups are represented by each line, even if the lines by demographic group aren't labeled. And that's a travesty, and that is still possible. So when we talk about equity, we talk about how do you get the bottom line, those kids that are on the bottom side of that achievement gap, how do you raise their trajectory so that their line eventually closes the gap and meets the line that is above them without sacrificing the achievement or engagement of those that are on the line above? How do you do both at the same time? And it is possible. However, what we say is this X marks the spot. So where those 2 lines come together and they begin to grow together after the gap has been closed, that's where equity lives. And so we go to our partner districts and say, show me your lines, right? You show me how's it going? Show me your lines. How's that gap going away? Okay. Well, thank you for going on that little trip. So we took a look at testing data, in this case, SBAC ELA over the course of time, in this case since 2014, so almost 10 years worth of SBAC data. You'll see the general trend across that time has been flat. Okay, on the right hand side, I know it's difficult for you to see potentially on the video, but if you have in your hands on the right hand side, I've just mirrored the labels from the key, so it's more easily visible as you go across all 10 years. And what you'll find is that there were slight increases, 1 point here, 2 points there, pre-pandemic in ELA. Post-pandemic, there was a regrouping of scores in 22, and then state and your less vulnerable populations within the district have either stabilized and or started to creep back up. However, your more vulnerable groups, in this case, students identifying as Hispanic, Latino, socioeconomically disadvantaged, kiddos on an IEP, and those that are learning English have not had the same rebound, even if slight, other student groups have had. Okay? So they are, and the gap is growing in most instances. That's for language arts. For math, the story is very much the same. Same groups are impacted. And it's similar, like I said, across for both ELA and for math. So then we took a look at socioeconomic disadvantage. We kind of broke that number down a little bit deeper. So in the district, you have 900, when last school year, you had 934 students that were currently experiencing socioeconomic disadvantage. Okay. Of that 934, 47 of them identified as Asian, 39% of them identified as two or more races, 82% identified, 82 individuals, not percent, identified as white, and 765 students identified as Hispanic or Latino. The numbers to the right of them are what percent of that student group to the left, that socioeconomically disadvantaged student group, mastered or exceeded standards on SBAC. So students that were socioeconomically disadvantaged and Asian mastered or met or exceeded standards on SBAC at a clip of 70%, two or more races at 59%, students identifying as white as 51%, the district average 26%, and students identifying as Hispanic or Latino at 19%. Okay? So when you find differences within, in this case, a group of students that are all already checking the box of experiencing socioeconomic disadvantagement, and there are still striations, it gives us another opportunity to say, you know what, there's probably another layer of the onion to peel back, right? Because it's the socioeconomic disadvantagement wasn't enough to unpeel the disproportionateness of achievement. So it's another opportunity to peel back and continue to peel back layers, which we'll do together. Level 2 is graduation. So we looked at graduation and the precursors to that, especially for in a pre-K 8 environment, is that of chronic absenteeism and suspension rates. And those are the highest predictors of students not graduating from an elementary perspective. So then what we do is we took a look at chronic absenteeism for 24, well, for the past about 7 years, but highlighting most recently the state average of 19%, Mountain View West at 11%. Then what we do is we take a look at the individual student groups below to see is there disproportionality or some students more chronically absent than others. And what we find is there's some slight elevation in socioeconomic disadvantagement, students with disabilities and students identifying as Hispanic Latino, but it is slight. And the numbers are on their way down from their post-pandemic high, right? So all student groups have made progress, in this case, in reducing chronic absenteeism at a rate that mirrors the rate that the state is also reducing chronic absenteeism. Okay, so it's on its way down, and it's, from a district perspective, it's 8 points lower than the state average. That is a great thing. And this is the chronic absenteeism rate by site, okay, from 23-24 and 24-25. District average is 19%. So we look at suspensions, right? When suspension data comes from CDE and Data Quest, they look at the 5 most serious offenses. The 5 most serious offenses are violent incident with injury, violent incident without injury, weapons possessions, drug-related, defiance only. Okay, and then there's another. The post-pandemic suspensions reached their peak at 22-23 school year at 277 suspensions from a previous high of 133 in 2016-17. They have been on a downward trajectory since 22-23, down to 269 in the following year, down to 189 in the year following that, which is 24-25. The area in which students have been suspended the most, or the most frequently suspended, is violent incident. No injury, it's the fight where no one got hurt, it's the pushing and shoving, traditionally speaking. Okay? When we look at suspension rates by site and overall, the suspension rates are low. So even though the bars may look high, you're working on when you look at the percentages, you'll see that it's a small number of students in the district, and it's smaller, which is also a good thing. So when you take a look at, like, again, the 23-24 to 24-25 suspension rates, we're talking single digits, and in all cases, either staying flat or reducing. And when you're cutting 1% of suspensions and your total suspension rate was only 2% to begin with, that's still great work. Okay, so there were 114 total suspensions out of enrollment of 4,000, around 4,800 kiddos for the 24-25 school year, which is an overall rate of about 2.4%. The other lens that we look at suspensions through is that are some students being disproportionately suspended multiple times? So there's one-time suspensions, and then there's multiple suspensions. Traditionally speaking, like across the, you know, having done this for a while and looking at the metrics across the state, usually about 75% to 25% ratio is kind of average. So it's, and you follow right in line there. Students getting suspended one time, it's 76% for most student groups, and then 24% of those students receiving individual students receiving multiple suspensions. Um, so there were 189 total suspensions. 144 of them were individual to unique students, and 45 of those suspensions were for students that got suspended multiple. So we look for disproportionality. There really is none. A little bit elevated, a tiny bit on students with an IEP. However, again, that it's not received with a finding and or a recommendation. Just something to keep an eye on, especially when there are other triggers in terms of IEP meetings and manifestation type meeting conversations when students with disabilities start to be not overly suspended, but receive multiple days of suspension. So we took a little bit of a look at stability pattern. This takes a look at how students are moving through the district. So the first bar is first group. So kiddos, this is all from 2018. How did kiddos who started as first graders in 2018 make it through their 8 years in the district? How did kiddos in 2018 as second graders make it through 7 years? You know, what percentage? And so on and so on through fourth graders starting in 2018. How many of them? And what you find is the percentage of students that stayed and that was stable was about 55% for the first cohort, 53%, 66%, and then 66% for that last group, which is on the kind of moderate to low side, right? So stability, student groups aren't quite as stable as you might want them to be. Not alarmingly low. The other wrinkle is that you're still working, not you collectively, but everyone is still working through. There's a COVID bubble in here that affects, definitely has affected student stability. It also affects student stability differently depending on the context in which you work, whether it's county or state or other local mandates were different depending on where you were. So it's difficult to quantify that across multiple districts or counties because everyone's experience during that time was very unique. So just know that's a little bubble, a little wrinkle that's moving its way out of it. So then we did look at persistence just from an elementary school perspective, K-5 rate. The district's K-5 stability rate was 58%. And then we just did it for the rest of the elementary schools. So Montaloma on the low end at 30% stability, Mistral at the high end at 60%. Principal turnover. So I'm going to talk about can impact student achievement. We have for the last 5 years, these are the numbers of new principal faces that each site has experienced. And high principal turnover usually has high impacts on student achievement from both direct and indirect ways. Really difficult to have long-term instructional or behavioral initiatives take hold when there's for lack of a better term, like a revolving door of faces from a leadership position. Weakening of school culture can increase teacher turnover through lack of support. Those are all things that can happen when principal turnover is high, and it also affects the students that are most vulnerable, and impacts them the more severely. And in this case, with 6 different faces in the last few years, the most vulnerable school being Castro, that is something that is kind of highlighted there as something to kind of keep an eye on with a real desire for some stability for them and the community they need. Last bucket, college and career readiness, really a data preview. We'll kind of look at some academic foundations. Had some long-term opportunities. We'll talk about reclassification and timing, and then we'll kind of look at some early course success through grades and the relationship of grades through SBAC results and the relationship there. So anywhere you see yellow, it means so this is grades. I'm going to begin at the beginning. I'm getting ahead of myself. These are grades at middle school number 1 through 7th and 8th grade. A, B, C, D, and then a DF combination, and then the total number of marks on the right-hand side. Anywhere you see something highlighted in yellow, it's a percentage that is above 30 in the area, 30% in the area of A or B. If it was a highlight in an area of D, F, or D and F, it'd be highlighted in pink. Okay. So for middle school number 1, what you see is for 7th and 8th grade, the predominant grades that are issued within 7th grade core courses for 7th and 8th grade are that of A's and B's. Okay. When we take a look at DF rates by student group, you have a couple groups in 7th grade that have elevated DF rates. Those would be EL, English language learners of 6 years and plus, which are your long-term ELs and students identifying as Hispanic or Latino in 7th grade. However, not the same elevation for 8th graders. It's an interesting dynamic. Then we take a look at span. So this one is interesting. And the greater the span, the more likely there is need for greater calibration amongst teacher teams on the site. And so what you'll find, and I'll use the most extreme example because it's the easiest to see, Math 7, which is just the regular Math 7 class, had a DF rate of 35%. Okay? But all the periods of that being taught with all the teachers at the same school, the same course maybe, just either different periods or with different teachers, the lowest DF rate was 10%, and the highest DF rate was 63%. At the same school, with the same, theoretically, the same batch of community kiddos, the only thing that's different is the period and the teacher. Okay? So what it does say is that there may be different ways that teacher teams are looking at calibrating mastery. Sometimes it can be more of a compliance based. Did you turn in all of your assignments and are you following the directions? Some can be more of a did you master the standard? And let's say they were all talking about mastering the standard. Then it's important, do they assess in ways that are common that have the same rigor and expectation for mastery? So all of those things have to line up for those things to be efficient and solidified so that the grade and the span of is not so drastic. So what you'll see is in this case, at middle school 1 with its trimester 3 grades, the lowest DF rate across all of the subjects was 3, and the high was 63. So it's probably there's a need for calibration amongst teacher teams. Mind you, it doesn't mean they're working any less hard, right? Teachers are busting their behinds, for lack of a better term. Everyone's working hard. Everyone's heart is in it. These are things that are just structures from the systems perspective that really provide the alignment that teachers need to lean on to say, how hard is hard enough? What are our guardrails? And then let us think in between the lines. So the same thing for middle school too, right? Dominant grades that are received are those of A's and B's. We look at see if there's elevated DF rates, and again, so students identifying, long-term English language learners and students that are currently experiencing socioeconomic disadvantagement had a few elevated DF rates within their core areas. For 7th grade, 8th grade, we're just long-term English language learners in both language arts and social studies. The story of grade level span is similar, not quite as wide, but still impactful. In this case, for science, when the example is 3% in one course in one class, one section, and 38% in another section. So then what we do is talking about grades, depending on how well everything is aligned and how much on the same page teacher teams are, grades can be super arbitrary. Like how do we know that those grades even mean mastery? So what we do is we say, okay, so let's compare them. How are kids' grades compared to how they're doing on SBAC? Not that SBAC is the end all be all, but it is the one hoop that every kid in the state has to jump through from grades 3 through 11. So minus grades 9 and 10. But so we take a look. And so for middle school number one, 73% of kids who got an A or B in their language arts class also met or exceeded standards on SBAC. And 70% of students who earned an A or a B in math earned standards met or higher on SBAC, again, for math. So yes, so in context, I don't know, is that good? Is it high? It's moderate, but it's on the high side of moderate, right? So it's not a bad thing. It means it's going in the right direction. It means it's pretty tight, pretty close at middle school one. And he said, okay, so what about middle school two? 87% of students who earned an A or a B in English language arts also met standards or higher on SBAC, which is high. 87 is beyond moderate, it is high. But on the counter to that, 65% of students who earned an A or B in math also earned standards met or higher on SBAC at middle school number two. So more higher than moderate middle school number two for language arts, mid moderate or low moderate for math alignment at middle school number two. So let me talk a little bit about ELD, ELD, reclassification of English language learners. This is a stair-step report. It's kind of laid out as on the left-hand side. You have years in U.S. schools. Okay? Remember, these do not equate to kindergarten, first grade, second grade. It's how many years in U.S. schools. And then across the top, you have LPAC score levels. One being beginning, two moderately developed, three somewhat four well developed, and then RFIB, which means those students actually reclassify. So what you want is you want students to be on track to have a 1 year's growth per year that they're in U.S. schools, ultimately, so they can reclassify by their 5th year in U.S. schools. In this case, 76% of your students are on that 1 year's growth trajectory stair step to reclassify by their 5th year in U.S. schools. 24% are on that. That should not be something that is alarming, but that is something to keep an eye on. But those students are at least 1 year behind that stair step. What was very interesting also is this last bundle here. These are students that all have already passed the LPAC. These students have already scored a 4. And in some instances, but they haven't reclassified yet. And so in some instances, that means they may not be passing an internal assessment, some sort of internal threshold for reclassification, even though they passed the states, or they may not have gone through the process yet. And so what's neat is that of the 181 students, I think in the last handful of, this part of the school year, I think almost 180 have been reclassified also. So that's kudos to the district, and it just shows your reclassification are looking pretty good. The other side of that is the acknowledgement that middle schools are receiving students that are at risk or already long-term English language learners at a decently high still. I think between the two schools, I think Crittenden had 49 students enter as either at risk or already long-term English language learners. And if I'm not mistaken, Graham had 96 students come in as already English language learners. Again, mantra is always set by 5. You want students to reclassify by their 5th year in U.S. schools. One, not because it's on a report, but it's really impactful to their success in later coursework. And also the reclassification process in terms of the assessment, it's really difficult once they move past, once they get into middle school and junior high. What's great, and I'd say what's interesting, is we have about 135 or so students that were either at risk or already long-term at the middle school. But if you look at the number of students that the middle schools are sending out as long-term English language learners, there's over 100 of them that have been reclassified from the time they get into middle school to the time that they leave, which doesn't happen everywhere. It is a great thing. So, for instance, I think I referenced roughly 130 some odd students that were long-term English language learners. Of the 63 students that went to high school out of Mountain View, Wisman, as still English language learners, 24 of them were long-term English language learners. When you had 130 to begin with, and 8 of those 24 students also are on an IEP, right? So it's a more complicated situation than just English language learner. So Again, it bodes well for the progress there. And again, kudos because that doesn't happen every. This is a summary of everything I said for the last 49 minutes. So it literally is, it's the previews all onto a singular slide. So this is a part where we'll start to see just a couple instances of pie charts. If you see a pie chart in there, it means we asked a question. We either asked a question via the survey or we asked a question via interviews. You'll start to see quotes in here. Quotes, if we color copies, yes. Quotes are in blue, just to indicate they are that quote. And please know that this was a completely anonymous and confidential process and remains so. So the only way that a quote will make it into to the report is if it were said by multiple people. So we didn't pick outlier quotes. We just picked quotes that were indicative of a theme or a trend to help add nuance to the data on this, okay, or to help tell the story. So first one is about adult expectations. We asked, in your estimation, how many students do you believe can successfully graduate UC or Cal State University eligible? In this case, that's A through G. Right? 53% of respondents said all or most. All was 14%, 39% said most, 30% said many, 15% said some, 2% said very few. We then asked the question, in your estimation, how many parents or guardians want their child to attend the university upon graduation? All or most was 68%. That's 21% that said all, 47% said most, 23% said many, 8% said some, and 1% said very few. And then just for reference, we had 351 staff members participate in the survey process. That was 12 administrators, 12 counselors, 97 support staff, and 230 teachers. And I know we'll get to the number later, but we have a parent survey also. 651 parents participated in the parent survey. That's a record for us, by the way. So kudos to the community and to your relationship therein, because that was great participation. I was excited to. We asked parents similar questions about expectations and opinions about education. How important is your student's education to you? And these are the 600 and the 651 respondents. 99 plus percent said it was either important or extremely important. And when we asked how far they wanted their student to go in school, 95% said they wanted their students to either go through finish a 4-year university or grad school. That was with all district respondees, parents, and then we isolated parents from the most vulnerable school just to see how that compared. Right? 99 plus percent of the parents at the most vulnerable school also said education is the most either extremely important or important to them, and 91% of the parents expected their students to be college bound. The remaining, give me a second. Here we go. I got it wrong. That's not, and that's okay. The remaining findings and recommendations are going to fall into 4 buckets. Okay, those 4 buckets are symbolic data systems, weak program design, Christmas tree effect, and weak system alignment. And what we'll do is we'll get into each of those as we go, and have data to show. So the first one is symbolic data systems. A preview of that, in most cases, curricular pieces are driving instruction, not the standards. It's not the standards aren't being covered, but they're being covered in the way that they appear in the adopted curriculum, and not necessarily driving the instruction. There's a weak calibration on the floor of grade level core instructional expectations, as defined by ASPE. Teachers are coming up with their own as either teachers or teacher teams, their own floor, their own set of expectations, and they're working very closely together. But from a system perspective, that's not something that goes from site to site from the district lens that helps establish what that floor is. It is very up to teacher teams at the individual sites and up to them. In most cases, common assessments monitor progress on developmental skills, rather than mastery of grade level agreements on chunks of instructional targets. And assessment results do trigger individual teacher reflection and out of classroom remediation. UDC is an emerging practice in the district. It's using data to generate team instruction responses with a few standard skills and or foci, which is definitely a step in the right direction. It is, however, it is, when I say it's emerging, it is more robust in some sites than others think it's new. And, but it is definitely a process that I think we've heard that one, that teachers value, and two, I think has long-term positive impact potential, provided it is nourished and the data that is being looked at is impactful data. So it says current assessment system answering the wrong questions. Well, let's talk about what the right questions, right? So the most helpful questions when doing like data inquiry and those types of methods are, what is the instruction for from this period of time? Like, what are my expectations and what do we expect students to be able to do? And then under what conditions will all students be able to reach whatever my form or expectations are? Right. So what does the planning look like? What am I planning to do? Three is how well did students learn what I intended to teach? So that indicates that the assessment that's being given is actually assessing what the teaching was intending to teach, and that the data is available and then reflected on it. And four is under what conditions will students learn what they did not master during that initial period of time. So after having the data, what do you do for students that didn't get it? What do you do for students that did get it and need to move on? Um, a lot of the data that's being used right now in Common, in this case, iReady, doesn't help answer many of those questions. What it does help do is it helps identify, some diagnosed learning gaps, and it also helps show some growth in some way, but not necessarily in a way that facilitates those more formative, instructional, deeper conversations. Not that teachers can't have them around that data, it just makes it harder. What I found is that what we have, I say we as a team have found through this process, is that teachers aren't just resting on that data as the stopping point. They're using all kinds of assessments. It's teacher created assessments. It's their common formative assessments amongst their team. But see, that's something that when we talk about the systems lens, those aren't things that move across multiple grade levels and or don't necessarily move across multiple sites because it's based on the team getting together to make those for themselves. Right? So um, that is some of the limitations with some of the current common assessment data from a formative practice. And again, this is kind of, I spoke ahead of my slide. So iReady diagnostic and even standard mastery reports don't necessarily get at beyond the DOK 1 and 2 levels. Largely, those questions are rooted in DOK 1 and 2, not 3 and 4. And it's really difficult to show mastery. Um, so it may cause false positives, false negatives. And then because these assessments don't necessarily align with instruction, it makes it really difficult to make formative decisions. This is something, this was pulled out of one of the UDC kind of data conversation charts on one of the sites. This is some of the typical data that was, at least at one site, that was being used during UDC. Again, the process is fantastic. But again, limiting. If it's iReady Standards Mastery Assessment 1, iReady Standards Mastery Assessment number 2, did the student improve or maintain, or did they decrease? Well, if that's as detailed and or robust as it gets, it's really difficult to know what next steps look like when that is a common data set that you have in your hands. Section 2 was week program design. They're highly fragmented schedules, and those schedules undermine sustained learning by repeatedly interrupting instructional momentum. It reduces the depth and quality of academic engagement. Now, we'll have a whole section on that. We're going to call it the Christmas tree because a lot of ornaments going on, so we'll get that in a subsequent section. Most instruction, again, is guided by curriculum pieces, and the common assessments that are available district-wide don't necessarily assess what students are being taught. They're more diagnostic in nature. Designated ELD was not only visible on all sites master schedules, but it was visible in person, when you're on site. The focus there, though, was on more of individual skills rather than a tie to a preview and review of core practice and core content, um, vocabulary development, and really robust oral language practice. Differentiation based on data, mostly diagnostic data, was largely remediation, and it was largely reserved for out of the classroom time. So the most of the differentiation that we saw didn't happen during tier one instruction or with the roster teacher. It happened with an interventionist or a coach or someone other than the teacher of record, um, more often than not. And then there were numerous opportunities for out of classroom intervention that were not aligned with grade level content and or grade level content expectations. Thus, they show little impact in student outcomes. We asked teachers, imagine that you're a teacher new to the school. Would you specifically know what content you're responsible for teaching? Right? 71% said most definitely. Okay? We then asked if you were a new teacher, would it be clear about the level of rigor that's expected from your course? Like, how hard is hard enough? And that goes out of 52% agreement. That's the most definitely. And then there exists agreement among teacher teams that teach the same subject or grade as to what students should demonstrate in order to earn a grade of A or B or C as their calibration. And 57% said most definitely. And so it is, there's just some teacher teams are tighter than others. Um, and some, they oftentimes refer to their own colleagues as their best support teams. Um, but it does start to raise the need for some sort of alignment and guiding documents that kind of help teachers to know what the guidelines are, other outside or inclusive of the adopted curriculum, but from a standards perspective also. So let me take a look at enrollment patterns for middle school math. And so what you see here is you have middle school enrollment in math programs for math 6, 7, and 8 on the left. You have the total enrollment of student racial and ethnic groups across the bottom. And then any box that's green, that means that student group was more than 10% overrepresented in that course. Or if it's red, they were more than 10% underrepresented in that course. So in this case, let's go with math 6 because it's across the top. So in this case, for students identifying as Asian, they made up 9% of math 6.1. However, their population is 23% of the total population of the district. So that is a more than a 10% underrepresentation in math 6.1, highlighted in red. Highlighted in green, math 6.2, they make up 40 Asian students identifying as Asian, make up 44% of the students in math 6.2, yet they only make up 23% of the total population. It's green. That's a more than a 10% over enrollment in that course. Okay? So that's all the reds and greens mean. The opposite is dynamic is true for those students identifying as Hispanic or Latino. So in math 6.1, they make up 54.5% of the enrollment in that course, yet they are only 39% of the total student enrollment. They make up 6.5% of student enrollment in math 6.2, but they make up 39% of the total student enrollment. So again, more than 10% overrepresented and more than 10% underrepresented. So this data starts to show us that maybe placement is imbalanced, right? Maybe there's a way to look and see ways to have maybe more equitable distribution of enrollment across a math course. Across math courses. We looked at it in a couple different ways. Right now, for the current admission into math like 6.2, which is the advanced placement math, includes both an iReady score with a trimester 3 score of 527 or higher, and then a CAST score of 4 or higher on which is standards exceeded for math. This just talks about, not to fast forward, this talks about using iReady. Is that me? No, it's okay. This talks about iReady as a course placement tool. And again, the district does use it in collaboration with aspects first, but the more diverse the data used for those key considerations of placement, the better. Sometimes an over reliance on iReady can lead to subtracting effects. And then there's also an appeal process for students that don't get selected or assigned to an advanced math class. And having an appeals process can also disproportionately, it can be used disproportionately by some families as opposed to others. Those with higher social capital, those with higher levels of comfort engaging with the system, or those with more time and confidence to advocate for their kiddos. Not necessarily a willingness or desire to advocate, but having confidence to do so. Okay. So we look. So then we look at also at math placement of kids that didn't initially get into advanced math. Okay, so this is kind of a busy slide. So bear with. We have the whole thing on every student on this slide. Every dot is a kid. Okay? Every X is a kid. What you have is the dotted line is you have that 527, which is that scale score that is the minimum threshold to get in to math 6.2 as a 6. Okay? Every student on here, as represented, already has an SBAC level 4. So they exceeded the math expectation from a state and SBAC perspective. So really the only variable here is their iReady score and their ethnicity. Okay? So in this case, every student on the top line that has a green dot was ultimately admitted into advanced math, even though they were in borderline status, and the students with the red X were not admitted into advanced math with almost identical borderline status. And it happens that all of the entries were students that were not identifying as Hispanic or Latino, and all of the entries that were not admitted were students that were identified as Hispanic or Latino. So there were 15 students that were Hispanic or Latino that had the exact same metrics as those that were admitted, but they were not the same. Again, this does not say that people are out intentionally excluding groups from advanced math. What it does say is that there's something in the system that is not necessarily engaging some to be more active in their approach to getting their kiddos and being heard. This does not also talk about the appeals process. Okay, we'll get into that next, and that'll kind of shed a little bit of deeper light on some of the nuance of this. Let's look at the appeals process. The appeals process, and this is for all of math, okay, for all grades, because the numbers were relatively too small to look at it grade level by grade level. And so what you have here is top of lines identifying as Asian, white, two or more races, and Hispanic, Latino. 100% of students identifying as Asian who appealed the math placement had their appeal granted. 85% of students who identify as white who appealed had their appeal granted. 75% of that or more races had their appeal granted. And 71% of students Hispanic or Latino had their appeal granted. One thing that's not written here, but is super interesting, is that the number for Hispanic and Latinos and for two or more students identifying as two or more races, those numbers only come from one of the two middle schools, because there were no appeals from one of the middle schools from either of those two groups. Okay? So all of the appeals came from a singular middle school, and one didn't have any. So it just goes to familiarity with systems, how comfortable is it as of a process? Does everyone know about it? So it's not people necessarily making intentionally racial or ethnic based decisions, but it's about how does this system supporting everyone, and does everyone know and feel comfortable in navigating the system? So again, this helps provide a little extra nuance to the appeals process. So also talking about impact of academic intervention staffing and its impact on achievement. So you have your regular ELA SBAC data there. it mirrors the slides in the beginning of the data that's in the beginning of the report, right? So you have SBAC data from 2016 to 2024. The black line overlaid there is the quantity of FTE of full-time equivalent of out of classroom certificated instructional support staff. TOSA's interventionists, all the labels. It's even though it's hard to read. In 2016 there were 17, and in 2024 there were 44. But you do see in that black line steadily marches up. Um, what you also see is those bottom three lines on the right hand side are your most vulnerable student groups. And there's a yellow one in there below, so I guess four of them are your most vulnerable student groups. And their data, as staffing is increasing, their overall proficiency is dwindling at the same time. So the increase in staffing, at least over the course of those 21, 22, 23, 24, hasn't had the desired effect, at least based on this way of looking at student achievement data. That's not to say that there aren't other ways to look at it, but in this glimpse, it does not appear to be having the desired impact. And I'll say it again, this does not come from lack of effort. We were on every campus. We saw reading intervention. We saw RTI. We saw STEAM. We saw teachers working well-planned lessons. We saw interventionists working hard, lovingly with caring kids. And it doesn't come, it's not a people issue, it's a structure issue. The design, it's not, in those interventions are not connected back to core. You can't necessarily expect it to move the needle here if it's not necessarily supporting what students are doing when they go back to the regular classroom. Right? Similar story for math, right? Obviously, it's the same FTE, 17 to 44, and for those most vulnerable groups, it's not having the desired impact. For those groups, students that are not socioeconomically disadvantaged, students identifying as Asian, or those students identifying as white, they're staying right where they were. There's no impact up, there's no impact down. So then we look at Christmas tree effect. Okay? This is where we start talking about the impact of schedules and instructional time. Okay? So current schedules reflect a commitment to robust learning opportunities and enrichment, but that is at the expense of sustained high quality instruction. The schedule divides today into short fragmented periods, whether those are official periods, middle school periods, or just chunks of time in elementary school, that interrupt instructional momentum and limit deeper learning. More academic time is diluted by excessive transitions and an overemphasis of non-blocks, reducing exposure to grade level content. This structure is disproportionately impacts the most vulnerable students who require sustained, uninterrupted learning to make meaningful academic progress. And out of classroom behavioral supports, as those have increased, so has the number of referrals. But at the same time, academic outcomes, as we just saw for the most vulnerable students, have steadily declined. So we'll look at that. So this is a sample third grade schedule from within the district. It is an actual schedule. I'm using it as a sample, but it's very similar from site to site. And it shows 850 minutes a week for instructional time. Right? More instructional time from an elementary perspective is for ELA and for math. Okay? 775 minutes a week for non-core instructional time. In this case, STEAM, PE, RTI, reading intervention, designated ELD, art, music, living classroom, etc. Right? There are quite a bit of extras. That means that only 51% of the week, weekly instructional time is actually dedicated to grade level content. I will mention that PE is listed in a non-core instructional time, even though those are required minutes, because they, at least at the elementary level, they are taught by someone else, so they require pull-out or a restructure of the block of instructional time. That's why it's categorized. Okay. But again, students, the fragmented learning, it can reduce retention of information. As teachers are getting started, they're having to stop they're losing kiddos to something else. Uh, and truth be told, some of the things that students are getting are great. You know, it's math. It's music. It's art. It's all kinds of great things. Um, but they're getting them in a way that is interrupting, I think, what the initial purpose is, which is really robust first instruction. Uh, how does it look at the middle school? So we have a sample eighth grade, excuse me, eighth period middle school schedule. And again, it's a little wordy, so I do apologize for that. There are 16 variations of the middle school schedule, by the way. So when you go look at you look at the middle school schedule, there are 16, I think, different options and variants. So I chose one. I chose one. Um, in the eighth period schedule, students are getting 812 minutes a week of core instructional time, which is ELA, math, science, and social studies. 820 minutes a week of non-core instructional time, which in this case is electives, PE, coding, robotics, etc. That means about 50% of the week of instructional time is grade level core content. In addition to that, with an 8 period day, there was almost 2 hours of transitional time, right? Passing period. Hour of 48 minutes a week of passing period. On top of that, in this model, there's no period that's throughout weekly. So potentially, you're not getting that 5 days a week, you're going to get it 4 days a week. On top of that, Mondays, because you go to all 8 classes, are only 41 minutes long. So by the time, a kiddo gets settled in, even if they're the most the calmest eighth grader in the world, is going to take a couple of minutes for them to get in and rested and ready to go. And then same thing for cleaning up at the end. So by the time on a Monday, you're really dealing with like 45-minute period. So again, all of these impacts come together, and for our most vulnerable kiddos, it really has an impact on proficiency, especially for English language arts and math. You wind up with slower reclassification rates, the potentials for widening gaps um, in reading development, algebra readiness. Um, and then the other side of the coin, though, is that for those more resourced parents, um, students that come to school without that have more educational exposure outside of the four walls of school, it may feel like a schedule that is perceived as well rounded. It may feel as a value for um, enriching electives and a very diverse offering. Um, so those are all part of the future planning conversation of how do you structure it so everyone gets everything, right? The hardest thing to do, and I think I mentioned this the other day, is the hardest thing to do is say no to another great idea. So being able to take a look, be able to take a look and say which of these are most valuable to us, meaning us as a community, and then making really robust and future oriented and maybe hard decisions about what the next steps would be. This is the impacts of behavioral support over time. Okay, so what you have a number of referrals that students that have been referred, behavioral referrals to the office. Green is for middle schools, blue is for elementary schools. In the data, there are two different types of referrals. There's a local and a state referral, so that's why there's two shades of green. That's why there's two shades of blue. We haven't listed there. The yellow line is the number of FTE, which is full-time equivalent behavioral out of support, out of class classified support for behavior on campus. So starting with about 16.5 FTE in 2017-18 and ending last year with 36 full-time equivalent folks whose job is in and around behavioral support. As the number of behavioral support folks has increased, so is the number of referrals. Right? And the data will tell you oftentimes, and research will tell you that is not abnormal. Some of it is because the efficiency of reporting. Right? We have someone actually enter them into the system now. There's also part of this, though, is about the reactive nature of the design of how they interact with behavioral issues. if they are positioned in a way that they are receiving students that are being sent out, well, if there's a landing place for me to send students out um, that is available, then I might learn to use that uh, to for the sake of doing or having to have a break or some sort of behavioral correction and or having just a timeout. Um, but what has happened is that as students are being sent out, as more staff are there to engage with them, they're being sent out at a higher clip. Then we take a look at the students that are being sent out, and is there disproportionality there? Is everyone being sent out at the same clip? So in this case, we'll just focus in on students identifying as Hispanic or Latino. They make up 39% of the total population of the district, and that has been remained consistent over the course of 5 or 6 years. It's, it's 1917. No, in 2017-18, they made up 30, again, 39% of total population, but 52% of referrals. In 24-25, they made up 54% of referrals. And then year to date, pulling data on December 2nd, they made up 61% of office refers. And then the total span is 55.3%. So, again, some of the students that need to be in class the most, ones that are being referred out of class the most. This, and I will say it again, this does not say that people are waiting around and and purposely referring students that are identifying as Hispanic or Latino out intentionally at a clip that is higher than others. What it does say is that there's probably some systems involved that are causing students to be disengaged and or not necessarily feeling as part of the fabric, which may be causing some of the disproportionality kiddos moving out. Okay? But it's system, it's not based on people. The last is weak systems alignment. So there's definitely a need for a kind of a clear, measurable strategic plan. In this case, starting with a strategic vision, right? A community-based, student, family based vision of what do you want to see the next 5, 8 years look like? And once that's established, backward mapping from that to say, okay, so in that 5 year vision, what does year one look like, and how do we measure it? What does year two look like, and how do we measure it? So that by the time you get to year 5, you're not lighting candles and hoping to get. You've known over the course of time that you're on course. District level services, the preview there is district level services are organized across multiple roles and departments. They can have overlapping responsibilities. And again, that can result in duplicated efforts, inefficient coordination, and that fragmentation can cause confusion and burden at school site level. Really, from a principal's perspective, um, sometimes you get you're not sure who to go to if there's more than one account that covers student services or nutrition, or and I'm just pulling uh, names, offices out of the hat. But there's a need to kind of take a look at that and see where the overlap is. And there's a need for deep front loading of site administrators as principals so that they can be that head teacher in charge and lead all things instructional and behavioral on their campus. And what that means is that it's deeper support for teachers on campus, that's a deeper support for students on campus, and that they are learning side by side with their teacher teams. So they, again, aren't just lost, but they're teacher at the same. But what can be done to accelerate student success? Okay, so we're almost there. Almost more slides. Aligning the curriculum, right? Having teacher teams engaged in a way where they are identifying essential standards from a multitude of lenses. It is not just what does SBAC say. It is also what does the local data say? What does the local teacher team experience say? And mixing all of those things together, what would be the most salient approach in terms of the essential standard? And then once you have determined what the essential standards are, you need a common formative way to assess them. So engaging teacher teams and creating common formative assessment actually match the state rigor of what's expected and that aren't a mystery or a secret to teaching, but they're meant to be something that they can back with math and plan um, leading into a nested data system where teachers are talking about student data at the same time site administrators are talking about classroom data, and at the same time district office talking about site data. Because not everyone needs the same thing at the same time. And when everyone's rowing in the same direction with similar data sets, you're able to more efficiently and nimbly mobilize all of the rich and robust reports that you have at your fingertips to who needs it the most. And those needs are going to change over the course of the year, always do. But being able to be and have those response systems, those data reflection sessions, all in a similar window allows the system itself to behave as one, and not to be fragmented. Program design. The first one was just calibrated design. Is what I just talked about. Level three is making differentiated instruction a regular part of the core lesson design, not a function of something separate. Paying attention to when planning instruction for the most vulnerable groups because they need higher growth trajectory to catch up. Right? We want those lines to cross. Right? Show me your lines. X marks the spot. Ensure designated ELD for non-newcomers. It's an opportunity to preview or review grade level core content with an emphasis on content, relevant vocabulary, and oral language practice. The impact of this is most effective when it's directly tied to core content and delivered to students that are grouped by English acquisition level, but only grouped that way during designated ELD, not throughout the day, not tracking them, but only specifically for that part of the day. Reconsider the instruction that supports support and staffing service model to prioritize direct instruction support for teachers and students in the core classroom and strategies that are rooted in current grade level expectations to accelerate student achievement, not remediation. Create multiple opportunities for instruction throughout an expanded day. Think about all the times that you can have access to kiddos, before school, after school, breaks, summer breaks, all of those times. Think outside the box and how to leverage those special times for not only increasing the trajectory for more vulnerable kids, but also providing the much loved enrichment that kiddos are already receiving in the district. That parents also equally love. Narrowing the focus, so it's reconsidering those behavioral support staffing models to be more preventative rather than reactionary, to have those supports be instructionally aligned, and reduce the reliance on exclusionary or pull-out practices for discipline. Is setting up this position of prevention rather than reaction. Shifting enrichment and supplemental extras to strategic windows with protected blocks of time for academics. This experience we apply when you do have these special times where students get really neat things like art and music and living classroom. There should be a way to directly tie them back to core instruction. But anytime there's something extra, much like a CTE class in high school, you're taking your core competencies and you're applying them to something that in actually the case is either career or technical based. It's the same thing here. Taking your core content, which is your language arts or your math, and now how can you then also integrate those into things that aren't necessarily your core content? Your art, your music, your STEAM, your all kinds of things, your robotics. Establishing district guardrails that require a minimum amount of uninterrupted blocks of time for instruction. I put in here 120 minutes for ELA and 75 minutes for math. That is not part of the recommendation. It's just an example. But again, being able to come together and say, how much is enough, and what do we need to safeguard, and then we can pepper the other things in around those protected types. And then from a middle school perspective, considering a district standard of no more than seven instructional periods a day, just like the uninterrupted blocks for elementary. I have an example of here of a 6-period day with a flex. That is not part of the recommendation, just an example of something else that can be done. Core courses, including English, math, science, history, and the arts, and PE should all be treated as pre-A through G, right? If the push is for students, and it is based on all of those parent results, all of the survey results from every single parent that participated, that is their drive that their students will be successful in college and post grad. That then the classes that they have now should be geared toward making sure that students have the stamina and habits and core content knowledge for that high school success. And by considering those courses pre-A through G, you're ramping up not just the rigor for some, but you're ramping up the expectations for all. Okay? Um, and anything outside of your time, those core instructional periods, um, it needs to be intentionally limited, or at least clearly justified of the impact, the positive impact that it will have. Whether it's an academic impact, behavioral impact, or a developmental benefit, but it, but not something that is not implemented. Right? Something that has to go some sort of process to be initiated. Last one. Engage students and staff and families and community partners in co-creating a clearly articulated district vision, 3 to 5 year district vision, and then backcast from that to define a very limited, targeted set of priorities, how they'll be measured, what the milestones are, and then commit to checking back in over the course of those milestones. Conduct a district-wide service alignment review, just to look for places where Java-like teams are doing maybe redundant tasks, or where the messaging from DO back down to sites could be confused because of multiple messages. But taking the time just to reduce to see where the overlap is, to hope to reduce the fragmentation there. And then the last one is to implement deep front loading and PD and professional development for site administrators on all core instructional and behavioral initiatives prior to their rollout, allowing principals to be a great resource for their instructional staff and just that support for their teachers. The other things that align and have principals coming together to create a principal community of practice, right? So they have other principals to lean on, right? And that they can talk about implementation challenges together and lean on each other for best practice. And with that, that is that. And so I do want to close with that of an honest, sincere thank you. You have been willing and open to really every request, data request, anything that we have asked. You've been super gracious, and we have felt that. And I am excited to see what comes next. And so with that, I head back to the board or the superintendent, whatever is appropriate.
Thank you. Thank you for that report. Stella, bring it back. Are there any clarifying questions from the board? Trustee Conley?
Thank you. I have a question for Superintendent Bear. So in an ideal world, this is about strategic planning, and we take 3 to 5 years to do kind of a community-driven strategic plan. We're also in a situation where there are budgetary concerns, and there will be some decision-making around budget very quickly that doesn't allow kind of the same in-depth process that a strategic plan process usually does. How do you see these two things working together, or what is the path or trajectory after tonight's meeting?
Right. So well, again, thank you to Scott. We appreciated having you here. And as I said in my opening comments, we don't always want the information that we want to hear, right? Or the information we want to hear isn't always roses and rainbows, but it's important that we hear it so we can do what's right by children in the school district. Yeah, we have a number of converging decision points that we have to pursue here, right? We do need to make budgetary decisions by the end of January. I'll remind you again. And we are pretty close to finalizing recommendations there. We have looked at the recommendations that we're bringing forward and mapped them against the recommendations that you heard from Arenda, just to make sure that that we weren't stepping out of line. I don't think it means that in the future we can't refine further, but uh, taking action to put us on the right path financially is critical. So I believe that needs to happen in the month of January. We also need to look at kicking off that process of identifying planning for what our 3 to 5 year vision is. So we can do those two things concurrently. I don't see a conflict with those two.
Thank you.
Any further questions? Trustee Lambert?
Yes. As I said before, thank you very much for your presentation, all the hard work that your group did. And I think you, especially thank you for trying to make it very clear, not using as much jargon as often occurs in educational presentations. One of the questions I have is you indicate and you seem to feel comfortable with a 5-year target for reclassification. Is it unrealistic to expect that to be shorter?
That's an interesting question. It is not unrealistic. Oh, I'm sorry. It's not unrealistic that in some instances, it may be a shorter path for some, as well as your data indicates that some have not taken their full years. You have reclassified kids after 2nd grade and 3rd grade. And in that case, those kiddos that had 1 or 2 to 3 years within U.S. schools. The 5-year from a state perspective, their 5th year is what you would want the final threshold to be, right? The no later than, right? So it is realistic to get there faster. But there are also systems like within the state, not here, but there are also systems in the state that rush reclassification and will have students reclassified. And then through the monitoring process, we'll have to go back and kind of re-massage that instruction because they did it too early.
Yeah, and maybe just to add a little flavor to that, I think what we all know kids learn a whole lot when they're young in elementary school, right? And to get them proficient as soon as possible so that they are, gaining knowledge and learning, not talking about getting ready for high school, but getting ready for middle school, right? And when you set a target, I'm satisfied with that. So, and your point is well taken about reclassification has to mean something and be meaningful. You just don't want to push things forward prematurely. So thanks for your comment about that. So that gave me.
Trustee Conley?
Too quick, and I apologize. I jumped straight to Superintendent Bear earlier. Thank you for the presentation and the detail and the data that is invested here. I know it's a lot of time by the team on the ground, and all of our community members and staff who participated as well. Building off of Trustee Lambert's question, my understanding is, and something that seems strange here is that the criteria for reclassification don't necessarily align with the criteria for SBAC proficiency in ELA. Is that correct?
So from
In terms of like the level, the LPAC, I guess.
well, the way that it works is that students have to have a 4 on LPAC to reclassify. Everything else after that is an LCAP measure, right? That it's part of the LCAP. So districts get to determine what it is that the internal measures for them to reclassify. I think is the question, what is the relationship between passing the rigors of LPAC versus the rigors of SBAC?
Yes.
They are similar and different. How coincidental is that? Students that through LPAC, one of the main differences is that even though, like, for instance, speaking and listening occur in both instances, LPAC is going to actually assess students speaking and listening, whereas listening is only assessed on SBAC. You'll also find that in those instances that on SBAC, students have multiple opportunities to listen to the things that they are listening to for those portions of the assessment where LPAC is one and done. Another major difference, and it's not a rigor difference, is in the manner in which those tests are delivered, right? SBAC is delivered on a secure browser through a state platform, TOMS, and very much rigorously and securely ratcheted down. LPAC is more one-on-one, and there is more opportunity, and not a district level comment, but generally speaking, there's more opportunity for human error in that process, depending on the training and the expectation of who is delivering the assessment to kids, because it can in some instances be a one-on-one variable. So the other thing about SBAC is that SBAC is revolved around state standards, and LPAC is really assessing students what they'll call reading and English acquisition through speaking and listening, reading and writing. So LPAC is not tied to California standards, whereas SBAC is.
Thank you. And then my second question is related to the slide that showed academic intervention staff increasing and student outcomes not. I think one of the challenges is the data we're looking at, because it's SBAC data, it's third graders and up. And our most recent interventions, the reading instruction that has been very targeted in the last few years has been primarily geared towards the lower grades. We did expand it this year to some of the upper grades, but the kind of the literacy strike team that was going in is focused on lower grades. I don't know that those students are showing up in our data yet because they haven't hit third grade. They're not taking the state testing. And similarly, Amplify is our science of reading curriculum that we implemented for the first time last year. Those kids aren't going to show up in our state testing until 27, 28. So do you have any feedback on how to make decisions around some of those, or just how to think about some of those intervention programs if we don't have an SBAC data point for them yet?
Oh, that's a great question. And you're absolutely right. Depending on the deployment of the reading interventionists, that the 3 to 4 years post reaching back may not yet capture those students in an SBAC lens. The second part of your question was, ask me again.
Similarly, the Amplify science of reading curriculum, we're only in our second year of implementation. And I would expect the largest impacts to change there to be when students who started with it in kinder hit third grade.
I think the biggest takeaway from this is the importance that when students are getting what we would call intervention, or what they're getting as extra or different, just check some very similar boxes, right? It doesn't supplant what they're getting from core instruction. So it is indeed extra. It is indeed an intervention and a supplemental, an extra support. And I think the other thing that we found too, that I think is a great lens to maintain when evaluating program and design, is in addition to filling, because as students get older, the reading intervention for a kinder and a first grader is going to look very similar across multiple kinders and first graders, because they're all learning to read. As the students get older, the gaps start to expand. And then what you'll find is, what we did find is that those targeted times are more skill-based and not necessarily connected back to core. And so I think that's where you find, you kind of set yourself up to have or it would be beneficial to set yourself up to have this, a process to just evaluate that. Is what we're doing, yes, making students closer to grade level, and is it tied to what current grade level is at the same time? Because once the grade level train kind of leaves the station, that gap will continue to grow if what they're getting is not on grade level. And it's not that it's not important, um, but any kind of remediation turns into acceleration once you tie it to core expectations of the current grade level. And I think that's the sweet spot. So no matter what the next kind of steps look like and or looking at other processes, I think that's a really important lens to keep. And I think that's how you'll, I think that'll be very helpful.
Thank you.
Any further questions from trustees? Trustee Lambert. Oh,
Another question. We've, we've known for a long time that, I'd say the under-resourced families are less able to take advantage of the opportunities within our school district. And I like that term, resourced. That's okay. I pointed that out. And, my question is we haven't been successful at doing that, even though we've thought a lot about it. And as you pointed out, and it really backed up with the data very, very well, is that we have structural and processes that sort of enable that and accentuate it. And my question is really, do you have any suggestions on how to, address these kind of issues? I thought when Trustee Reed and I spoke with you, you had a really, just a good comment about default, default placement into math programs. And so you might want to share that with other trustees.
We had been talking about the student disposition in math placement specifically, and in a previous principal context of my own personal experience, we had something similar in our district around AP coursework, and we had a community that was 95% socioeconomically disadvantaged, 80% English learner. Schools were gigantic. My elementary school where I was principal was 1,200 kids. And we also had the dynamic of where the system was gatekeeping kids from AP courses, kids that probably could and should have at least had a chance to show that they could, because we knew they could. And what we did is we shifted the disposition of you have to beg, borrow, and steal to get into those courses to you have to beg, borrow, and steal to get out of those courses. So what we did is we had this open enrollment plus this kind of robust marketing and push to get kids and families to say, you know what, start there. And if we need to adjust, we'll adjust the supports. Well, under what conditions are necessary for you to be, and then we can dial it back. But the shift in that dynamic of rather, let's place you there and then work our way back if we have to, meant 30 to 40 to 50% of the kids that started there that wouldn't normally have thrived. And in that instance, 2 or 3 years in a row, the district was not just acknowledged for enrollment, diverse enrollment, but test passing of AP success. So that was something that was super dynamic, and it may be something that might be helpful when thinking about how to approach math placement here in the district.
What I particularly liked about that approach was that it gives us as a school district the responsibility to bring those children in rather than always trying to ask the parents, right, to advocate and express their interest. You showed very clearly on your slides, there's the interest there. They want to excel, okay, in all different ways. So, we can help them do that, right? So thank you.
Sir, thank you.
Trustee Reed.
Yes, I just wanted some clarification on the program design slide when you're talking about the different levels. Level 8 was create multiple opportunities for instruction throughout an expanded day, including before school, during the day, after school, Saturdays and breaks to help students reach grade level expectations. I wanted more clarification on what that kind of would look like, but also in the context of remediation.
Yeah, so good question. So, first think about the things that you already have, right? Not inventing new things, but you may have before school, definitely have after school program. There are probably midday tutorials that are going on. And there may be, some flex scheduling at the middle school. So, or win time or things like that. What is immediately important though is to agree on what the academic floor is first, right? So you have to have agreement on what the foundation is. So once you have the agreement on what that foundation is, everything in the system can be influenced by that. So picture this. You have a fourth grade team of teachers across the district that come up with these 25, 30 essential standards with a way to assess them. Um, that they came up with, and they're ready to roll with them. That winds up being the base for everything that a fourth grader is going to encounter potentially throughout the year, which means that I would want my after school programs, whether they're internal or external, to be influenced by what they're doing right now in the core classroom there. I would want my electives to be influenced with what they're doing there and then right now. If they're in the middle school and it's seventh grade, it's not just the English teacher's responsibility to make sure students are being successful in ELA demands. How is the social studies, science, history, PE, how are teachers that teach non-English courses being influenced by what students are supposed to be doing within their English class, as an example. So understanding what grade level is first, and then making sure that that is the roadmap that everything takes, RFP, the whole nine. That's how you get everything dialed in. So to me, that's where it starts. And if it's tied to core, there will be some things that an after-school provider just can't do, right? Because of the nature of staffing. You'll have, sometimes my own son's after-school program was staffed with 22-year-old, fresh college kids. They're not trained, reading interventionists, but there were things that they could do that were tied to core that they could do, whether that's vocabulary, younger kids, it's high frequency words. There's all kinds of things that can be done, but you don't want them to be random things. You want them to be things that are specifically tied to what the expectation is back in the core class. Once all those things start tumbling together, man, it's so efficient and it feels different. Yeah.
Trustee Henry?
Just following up on what you've just talked about, you've talked about that you've seen at the different sites, individual, like the fourth grade example of, fourth grade team at an individual site working together on things, but not seeing it kind of across the district. When you have seen in other districts where they have built these district-wide standards together, what does that process look like?
Oh, interesting. What does the process of building the process look like, or what does it look like from? Because one is kind of building the system, and then the other one is that what does it look like from how do you see these combined kind of collaborative experiences after the fact?
I guess just the initial building of that across, for example, the entire fourth grade staff
Yeah.
across the
So
district.
initially, obviously there's a ton of ways to get after it. They are each step is increasingly dependent on time, right? Time where all teachers at a given grade level are available, whether are designated, professional development days, whether there are days, I don't. And as much as I do know about your district, I do not know about your sub situations, right? Substitute teaching situations. So those types of things. But when creating those aligned, essential standards and assessments, more hands are always the right answer. So the want would be to have as many participants as are willing, and the um, and not to stray into having multiple sets of essential standards, right? Not done by site, because then you lose the commonality in that. Once you have the standards carved out and you start to develop assessments, those things, that's not necessarily a process that happens overnight or in 2 sessions. That's sometimes a process that can take an entire year, right? Because of how much meat on the bone there is to get teacher teams together, how much you actually want them to digest the why behind what they're doing, how much actual professional development and learning is involved in the conversations around digesting the standards. Teachers are all familiar with the standards, but they all interpret them their own way. So when you layer that on top of how hard is hard enough, and even teachers of 15 and 20 years experience will sometimes look at SBAC item specifications and say, I never knew that they were going to ask them like that, because there are so many, and that's all public stuff. So to me, the best professional development teacher teams I've ever gotten, at least my own, I'll speak for my own example, is by having gone through that process. So, but it's not something that takes 2 sessions and done. It's something that can take that part of building that floor. It could take up to a year to do that. So.
Superintendent.
Yeah, I mean, I would concur, having done that previously, it takes time. It's time well spent. It builds a foundation for an entire school district. It embeds a culture of expectation in a district, but it takes time, right? It's not a buy something out of a box package, off the shelf kind of thing. It's investment of time. It's investment in our people. It's supporting our teachers in the classrooms. It's all of that. And looking at that, I guess that's a pyramid. Maybe it's more of a ziggurat, but those are built on top of one another, right? We have to build floors 2 and 3 before we get to level 8.
And I was just going to say that's where the longevity comes from, right? That's where the staying power comes. And that's what makes it not something that was a great idea a year and a half ago and then gone 2 years from now. Because that's a lot of initiatives, a lot of things you try, not you particularly, but in schools we do. That's what it looks like. We did this one thing for 2 years and that wasn't the flavor of the week anymore. That went away. But this is more foundational than that, because everything else will be layered right on top of it. So, go slow to go fast.
Any further questions? Okay, I will ask one question. I think wraps around to Trustee Conley's initial question to Superintendent Bear. Right, we have 4 categories of recommendations here with sub-recommendations within them. We cannot do all of them at once, right? Like we can't kick all of these things off and try to do them. Do you have some sense of the things that, and it doesn't have to be a rank order or something, but like the things that you would front load for us to work through in a recommendation sense, and the things that we will take longer to roll out, and so that we can kind of make the most of the time we have, right?
That is a great question. And I use a funny anecdote. It's like, how early do I start my brisket? Because the beans only take 2 hours, right? So the brisket is the alignment. It's the instructional alignment, because that could take up to a year to even start to take shape, which is having teacher teams have conversations around, with the lens of local data, teacher expertise, and state expectations woven into one to build the matrix of essential standards plus the common assessments. So I would say that would be something that would be one of the first cans that I would knock off the fence, or at least get the ball rolling in that. The second part of that is really, there are some things in there about taking a look at that might be easier. There are things that we're taking a look at overlap, maybe at the district office of roles and responsibilities. That doesn't affect a ton of people outside of the district office to complete that step, and maybe a low-hanging fruit. I think some of the other processes obviously will fall in between there somewhere. There are a couple that you wouldn't want to necessarily wait to do until the essential standards are done. Starting to have, before that, having conversations around what does intervention look like? how do we integrate more differentiated instruction in our regular tier 1 or classes? Like, those are things that are conversations that can start immediately, and that are already happening in some places. The only reason why it lands in here is not because it's vapid everywhere. No, it's just not happening as a system. So being able to kind of leverage those sweet spots and start to have those broader conversations earlier rather than later. But I would say priority number 1, because of importance and because the time it takes, is starting the alignment process.
Thank you.
And can you kind of tagging on to Charles' question? Is it okay if I ask a question? What about the idea of schedules and time is another thing you really
Yeah.
highlighted as a roadblock for especially our most vulnerable
Yeah, no,
students?
and that's great. Without having the list in front of me, those are things that can, well, from protecting instructional time is absolutely something that can be done immediately, right? Especially from relatively immediately from an elementary school perspective. I don't pretend to understand the intricate pieces that go into potentially changing a middle school schedule, but I imagine they might not be as easy as adjusting elementary things. However, those are things that I think would have immediate impact, not only on achievement, but because those things were so on the lips of all teachers, that would be something that would be appreciated and viewed as a huge step in the right direction, to alleviate some of the frustration that comes with those fragmented days. Right? So that's a good, thanks for bringing that up. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Further questions? All right. With that, I will now open public comment on this item. If any members of the public in person wish to address the board regarding this item, please turn in a speaker card. If you're online, please use the raise hand function. I'll wait to see how many speakers we have and then allocate the time accordingly. I see 3 in-person speakers and none online. Is that correct? Okay. With that, I will close the time for public comment. I will allocate, let's see, 3 minutes for each. One more. There. Yes, people in person will be first, and we have no online speakers, but so we have 4. We have 4, and I will still get 3 minutes per. No. All right, our first speaker is Stephen Nelson.
Good evening. On this great external review, number 1, I'd like to say pathways is a name to disguise what tracking is. All the rest of the world calls what we do in middle school tracking. And I'm glad this report used that name. Recently, a Common Core 8.0 math track resulted in, at the end of the year, 0% of the students in that track were meeting grade level. No matriculating students. If you go into the slow track, you don't get off. That's what the data shows if you do Public Records Act, or you get access to the school data showing how students move between these tracks. In actuality, that's actuality. That's not a theory. That's what the data shows. Number 2, relative advantage. They find they're sliding back relative to other districts. And it's even worse for the SED for the last 5 years. I keep on showing you this elementary school division rankings tree. school ever rankings, these little 24 to 25, I'll call them fuzzy wuzzies now. They're little caterpillars. We like to see moving from 24 to 25 that they're going up or they're going just a little bit down. But what we found year after year for the last 5 years, these school rankings that are amalgamated versions of math and English are going down. There's good statistics showing that this effect we see in the individual SEDs thing is affecting the whole district, and particular Castro is down at the bottom. The school that 150 years ago was started as a escuela school for the Spanish students in that part of town still has this socioeconomic discrimination and segregation. So number 3, SED falling math. It's consistent relative to the state for the last 5 years of data. 2023 was a crossover year with the state. So math placement, it's not working as a meritocracy. There's a clear independent data showing that now, 4 slides. I hope the trustees who maybe are incredulous about this, look at that data. I had a Public Records Act from pre-pandemic that showed this. This also independently shows us we do not have a meritocracy in how we put kids in those middle school math classes. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Nelson. Next up is Priya. 3 minutes.
Thank you. My name is Priya, and I'll ask a few questions. Number 1, I'm just curious if you guys analyzed how specific PTAs and the extra money that is spent on them impact the schools. Like, for example, from reading, I'll just cut to the chase. Like, for example, MEMI has a Run for Fun program. There's certain schools pay for Imagineer assemblies. Landals has Playworks. Did you look specifically at that and how might that impact schools differently? Number 2, did you look, and I heard you mention the sub thing. I think this is a really big conversation to be having. Did you look at the sub situation at each of the schools? Because I think there's more, as you said, like to peel the onion and really look at the nuances of the situation there. Did you get a chance to see how long-term and short-term absences affect certain schools more than others, especially ones that have a sub issue versus not a sub issue, and how what may be called redundancy is actually allowing for education to still be taught when large numbers of subs are not available, and at least kids are getting educated because what you may call a redundancy is at the school. And I think we need to have a really, really bigger conversation around that. Also, did you look at how the choice school, when you looked at choice schools, what insights did you get from their impact? And then also, I appreciated the fractured schedule conversation. Yeah, I can say a lot of that, and there were some great things that were mentioned there. I am intrigued about the data around and what your observations are regarding how what we call fractured scheduling might also be benefiting kids who need to walk from place A to place B to get the restart, or who might benefit from different teachers throughout the day, because if they get a teacher that they don't jive with, how that might long-term impact them for the entire first grade. Have we looked at that? And I'm sure you have, but I'm curious. And then lastly, I love the idea of what I would call thematic teaching, aligning art with what we call our core subjects. But do we have to get rid of people in the name of thematic teaching. And I leave you with that.
Thank you. Next, we have Nicole Data.
All right. Hi, I'm Nicole Data. This is my 12th year at Castro. My whole career has been spent there, and I just wanted to say, on behalf of Castro, a school that gets talked about a lot. We're in that lovely red often, all the time. My request would be that you guys would come and talk to us. Come see the kids. Don't just have us on a data point. Don't make decisions for us when you are not on the ground. There's people there that are so passionate. My whole staff is passionate. And yes, we are on our 7th now principal in 5 years. But we still want to be there, and we love our kids, and our kids work so hard. And before all these big decisions are made, please come and be there and see it and talk to us and talk to the kids. Get a translator, whatever you need to do, because Castro's amazing and it doesn't get said enough. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Next card is Jessica.
Hi, my name is Jessica. I'm a parent in the district. I'm also a partner of the district. But I just have one clarification question in the chart under the core. I was curious why STEAM, which is addresses science standards and math standards, was not considered core, but once you hit middle school, science is a core. So I was just looking for clarification on that.
Superintendent Baer, if there's a clarification.
I would say in response to that, I would say that it was similar. Scott, correct me if I'm wrong, but it was captured that way because of the effect it had on the continuity of the schedule, much like PE was described. Not for its content, but for the way it is affecting the schedule. That's the why.
Yeah, and if there's further questions, we can follow up afterwards. And then in the interest of full public comment, I'll take this last card that made its way over to me. Missing a name, I think. Young.
Hi, thank you for the presentations. I was curious when I was looking at it. There were 7 schools that you did the deep dive on. I was just wondering, was there a specific reason why those schools were chosen to have 3 more visits as opposed to like the remaining 4 schools? And then regarding the middle school appeal subgroups, you have the percentage, but I'm curious about like the amount of appeals for each subgroup. Kind of, try to tie the number with the percentage. And then about the subs, I just learned recently that like the high school, they have a pool of full-time subs. And what happened is that like, so I think in high school, I mean, they only have 2, and they have like 5 or 6 full-time subs. So anytime that like there's teachers out, they tap those up first. So that it's like, I think it make it easier to have this pool of subs. And then teacher will be able to find time to collaborate as cohort, So I mean, we have 11 schools, so it's a little more complex, but that's what the high school's doing. So I thought it was great to hear and share. Instructional minutes. I know, like, I understand that it's like the long, like there's stress in instructional minutes, but I feel like for instructional minutes sometimes also like, what does that mean exactly? Does it mean like the butts in the chairs and like learning, or is it like actually also experiencing, so that you have that, that hands-on experience that then retain in your brain so much better. So I just hope that instructional minutes is viewed in like just not in a black and white sense, and in like, oh, paper, pencil, sit and write, but more in a dynamic and robust learning sense as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Floor is now closed for public comment, and I'll return to the board for discussion. Any member of the board like to start? I can kick it off, folks, because I think it's useful for us to take this time to, I know we're all processing a lot of information. There's a lot here to go on, so I do have, I wouldn't say fully organized thoughts, but I have things that I took away from it that I'm trying to think through, and maybe we can, as we discuss, we can start there. So, I think, right, the major thing hearing from the report, we have incredible staff, kids, community that all really care and are pushing for, achievement for kids, but we're not seeing the outcomes that we want, right? And I think part of that is because of the systems that we have, which is why we have this report, like the systems that we have, where we have a lot of things where everyone's working really, really hard and everyone's trying for this, but things aren't sticking together, right? Like they're not working in concert. They're not aligned and pushing in the same direction. And I think as we start coming back, trying to build these systems so that those gears link up, so that like all of that effort, or a lot of that effort isn't going to friction, isn't going to things running independently, and it's actually working together efficiently to help this. And I think that's going to be a big theme, I think, for the coming weeks, months, years, as we like try to understand where we can make those improvements to start linking these things up together so that we all are pushing in the same direction. I think some of that is going to start, we're not going to be doing the hard work of actually doing it, right? Like everyone else out there will be, but our job right here is to, represent the community, try to represent their priorities and the things that they want to see and set those priorities for staff. Staff's going to be the ones implementing it. Parents are going to be there with their kids. Teachers are going to be there trying to do all this stuff, doing the same hard work they're doing, but hopefully pushing as one vision, right? And so us setting those priorities, I think, is going to be a discussion that we're probably going to have to start having over time. And some of that is the long-term planning process, right? Trustee Colley.
Thank you for taking the first step, President DeFazio. I think, but always coming back to what we're actually doing is we're representing students, right? Like we are here to serve students. We are elected by the community. We take input from every single level and factor of the community. But our job is about serving students. And so I think this was a fantastic starting point. I am very thankful for the light that was shined on many issues. The slide around the students who were on the borderline for math placement and having that stark contrast based on race is appalling. That should not be a practice within our district. So we have work to do. Some of it, I think we're going to have to do a little bit more quickly than would be ideal for a strategic planning process because of the budget considerations. But I would rather have this information going into a discussion about our budget than to not have it. So I'm thankful for that. And then I think I also want to, we are processing this, but so is everyone who's here tonight. The presentation wasn't available for the public ahead of time. And so I anticipate and look forward to hearing from community members as they, including staff, parents, as they process this presentation. And there are going to be things that we haven't thought of when we saw it. There are going to be different perspectives that might not have come across in our own conversation. And so I really hope that people can write in, reach out, share your perspective on this. We will be having a board meeting next week around budget. And so the sooner the better to be really helpful. I often say to people in a board meeting, trustees, we can't talk to each other as a group outside of a board meeting because of the Brown Act. We can't make a majority decision outside of a board meeting. I can pick one Brown Act buddy. We can talk to each other and we can't talk to anybody else about any given topic, right? And so when people write into us and present information or arguments, it helps us, instead of coming into a meeting and getting from point A to B, it helps us get from like point D to point G, because we have seen all of these different conversations and perspectives presented by others in the community. It's incredibly helpful. So if you have thoughts on this, please write in and reach out. I know we're all willing to talk with people as well, but it would be extremely helpful.
Along those
Let's do that.
lines, Superintendent Bear, could you outline what will be presented on this topic during the next
Yeah.
board meeting,
We
the final one?
need to just discuss this report for the special meeting. I don't think we can talk about the next meeting. We can say, we can ask what next steps are after this, but I don't think we can discuss what will be presented at the next meeting in the special meeting.
At some point, the public would like to.
Well, what I can say is you're gonna get the first glimpse at recommendations regarding budget. And it will certainly be informed and influenced by this report. If I can add one other thing. So Orenda Education has had formerly Principals Exchange, right, renamed, has had tremendous success throughout the state of California with districts who work through their recommendations, right? Change is very difficult. I realize that organizations have a natural resistance to change. We saw 3 years of data up there that showed us getting progressively more advantaged, but serving our students not as well. We didn't change much this year compared to previous years. I would expect that there'll be a 4th year on there that follows that pattern. If we don't change something, the way we are allocating resources in the support of students, that will not change.
Yeah, I think there's another thing that I was thinking through as we're talking, right, like about how everyone is working very hard. Sometimes changing how we're working can feel like another new difficult thing to do. But I think working together, we'll start seeing that as we get over that hurdle, it will, I hope, feel easier as things work together. Because right now we're in this mode where there's this friction and things aren't tying together. And then we're asking to work differently, but with the same energy that we have from all the staff, right? So I think that's going to be a hurdle to get over, and it's hard. Like I've gone through that in my work life. It's not easy, and I'm sympathetic to everyone that when we have to do that. But I think that's an important thing to keep in mind, is that we do share the same mission, and everyone does this because they care about kids and getting them educated. So not to diminish the effort that folks are putting in today. Trin?
I was just going to say, I mean, I
Color?
think the board would probably agree with me, Superintendent Bear, that we brought you here to help us create change that is focused on our students. And so thank you for working through this process and kicking this off. And, you know, you've had much experience in this. You know how hard it is.
It is.
And
It's difficult.
so thank you for stepping up in that.
I would just add that this isn't about working any harder or less hard. It's not about that at all, right? It's working in a way that gets us the results we want for the children of our community, right? The 91% of the parents at Castro School whose expectation for their children is to go to college, we have to meet that. We have to meet that expectation, right? So we just have to work differently, tweak some things, and align our work together, and we will get there and deliver on that for those families.
Trustee Henry, do you want this?
I think just reflecting on, you know, where we are with this, I'm very glad to have this report as we go into our budget discussions, knowing that that what you did is not about the budget discussion, but that it informs the conversations that we'll have in the short term, but also the longer term. Um, looking at the strategic plan, I think the numbers that I saw in the slides about relative advantage were some of the ones that particularly hit home for me, because now that we are 5 years past kind of shut down, um, along the past 5 to 6 years, I think it's been clear that things are different for children post, that shutdown period. But one of the things that stood out in the way that these numbers are changing for us relative to the rest of the state is showing that it's time to move to, like, deal with where we are right now, and that other districts have been able to kind of move out of that sort of stagnant, just immediate post shutdown, kind of flat growth, and have been growing. And I think seeing it in that way that you put it together was hard, but also really important as we go forward. I also think it's really important that all of the adults in the district share the vision that our parents share their children, of wanting them to be, able to go to college and grad school and everything else that they may want to do, and to be able to have all the choices in front of them. No one last thing, last thing, lots of thoughts, but one of the other things about the way you presented it that really struck me is a way of phrasing kind of unify, like how we think about that TK to 8 curriculum of being that pre A to G, that what we do leads them to be able to make, because I want our kids who leave this district to be able to take whatever course they want to take at Mountain View High School, South Coast High School, and to be ready to do it and to be ready to be successful. So that is a lens that I really appreciated, is the way you phrased it.
Trustee Reed?
I wanted to piggyback on some of those comments. I also was taken aback by the slide on how adult expectations can influence student outcomes, and seeing adults that our children are interacting with on a daily basis, who sometimes our children are spending more time with their teachers than they are with their parents. And there are some of them who don't believe that all these students have the ability to achieve. That's problematic. And to see the opposite side of the parent reactions of, most of our parents see that in their children, but yet the people that are spending more time with their children aren't seeing it the same way. That's a major misalignment that we need to address. And also going to the disadvantagement, we are a very resourced district. We have a lot of funds and resources and various programs in place to help support, and seeing those graphs where the amount of people we're putting in place to fix issues, but yet we're actually seeing declining in our most vulnerable populations. It's something that we need to take a deeper dive of, and peel those onion layers back and really think about, what are we doing? We're doing a lot and people are working really hard, but clearly we're not working in the direction that we need to be working in to really effectively change the trajectory of where these kids are headed. And ultimately, that's what it's about. We are here for the children, and seeing a lot of the data from this presentation was really eye-opening, in that we have decisions to make, and we have a better idea of how to prioritize, and a better direction to head that is really going to be servicing these students better than what we've been doing.
To further, I think, discuss the prioritization item, right? I think as we're talking about schedule and minutes, right, there's another thing that is a finite quantity that we're dealing with, kids' time in the classroom, and as a board discussing how we want to prioritize that time, like what we think is the right thing, given recommendations from staff. Like, I mean, I'm not an expert on this stuff. But we ultimately like will be setting the vision for that, right? Like that's you have recommendations and we'll listen to you and push back on you when you have, right? Like, but we ultimately are the ones who are deciding how that should go. And as we start making these choices, as we start as you all start implementing this, I think one of our major, we have the vision to set, and the other major role we have is to make sure we are getting the results that we expect from this, right? Checking in on these things and making sure they're going right. I want to avoid as best we can the Christmas tree effect that we've had, right? That was identified here, where it's very easy to add things, making sure that they're worth it, making sure that they're working at the right time scale. Some things don't happen quickly, right? Like the investments we're going to make are some are longer term and we expect them to be long term. But being clear-eyed as we do that for what our expectations are, having milestones we check in on, and just getting that here so that we can continue, you know, building systems for this district long after all of us are gone. For, you know, a great society, right, is one where people plant trees that they'll never sit under, right? Like these are things that we're setting up to be in motion for outside of for when we're here. So.
And that's the beauty of the strategic planning process and setting measurable goals. So I'm glad we're in this process, and I'm looking forward to moving forward with our team and with our community on it and focusing on students.
Any further discussion? All right. With that, I'll end this item. Let me pull up my agenda. Thank you. Now we're moving on to item 3, future board meeting dates. The future board meeting dates for the next regular meeting are January 15th, 2026, and there's one on January 29th, 2026, and February 12th, 2026. We have any public comment on this item? Seeing none. Any online? All right. With no further business, meeting is adjourned at 8:34 p.m. Our next regular meeting is January 15th, 2026.